topic is emerging trends and developments, anti-authorities extremism, anti-authorities narratives, and we have on two very exciting, interesting speakers with us today. Maybe a few words first on the topic itself. So within the RAN, the rise of anti-authority extremism and related narratives following the COVID-19 measures has been explored within several formats, with several RAN activities throughout the last 2 years, including during a thematic event and a cross-cutting event on the topic of conspiracy narratives and anti-government sentiments, and a number of other of course, meetings also within RAN policy support, focusing on violent protest. We had a meeting from the RAN local working group earlier this year on violent protests related to anti-government movements, links to violent right-wing and violent left-wing extremism, but also a lot on conspiracy narratives as a driver. Earlier this year, obviously, the shift of a lot of the anti-government narratives to the Russian invasion of Ukraine have led to some sort of regrouping of extremist actors and communities, and that have further implications for PCV practice. And of course, we are going to try today to make sense of those developments, to disseminate the knowledge that we have gathered within all of these RAN meetings before, but also from research. That's why we have RAN policy support speakers with us today. And also to help PCV practitioners understand how these trends are manifesting and what they mean for their practice. I'm very happy to see today a lot of practitioners indeed, and some of you have participated in previous meetings. I hope you can find something new for you today. So we have today with us first Teun van Dongen, whom I'm going to introduce in a second, who's going to speak about anti-authorities extremism and its narratives. And then we are going to turn our attention to the phenomenon of foreign fighters, volunteer fighters in Ukraine, within the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, and Kacper Rekawek is going to talk about that. After that, we're going to have a joint Q&A session where you can, as already mentioned, pose your question in the Q&A section. We're going to prioritize your questions, and hopefully we can cover as much as possible. And then we have a few closing words. That's it from my side on the program, and without any further ado, we can jump directly to the program and to the first speaker. Again, repeating this because it's sometimes, if you're struggling, just log off and try to log in again if you have any problems hearing us or seeing us, and hopefully it will work out. Otherwise, you can approach us directly in the chat. So our first presentation today is going to be from Teun van Dongen. He's the program lead, current and emerging threats at the International Center for Counterterrorism, ICCT, in the Netherlands. He's also part of the RAN policy support project. He leads the ICCT's efforts to monitor, analyze, and research various forms of extremism and terrorism. Previously, he worked at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies in Leiden University. He has a PhD from Leiden with a dissertation about counterterrorism effectiveness, and he has 2 published books on radicalization and counterterrorism. So, Teun, the floor is yours. Please, my colleagues, I kindly ask you to share Teun's presentation. Go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rosita. Probably not the only one in today's setting who grew up intellectually studying terrorism. And in studying terrorism, the problem is always the definition. Like, how do you define it? Maybe with today's topic, anti-authorities narratives or anti-authorities extremism, the problem is even more fundamental, in the sense that we're even struggling with how to name this thing. So is it anti-government extremism? Is it anti-authorities extremism? Is it anti-institutional extremism? Like we all like know and feel that there's something there, but it's at this point, I think, still hard to tell what it is. Like it overlaps with the far right, but it's not entirely the same thing. I personally have a slight preference for anti-institutional extremism, because what I mean when I speak about this is the movement that believes that important institutions such as the government, but also the media, academia, are working against the interests of the people, like social construct, if you will, that these institutions are supposed to cater to, but are actually working against. And I'll address the extremist element later, but in spite of the conceptual difficulties that still surround this phenomenon, I'm gonna take the next 20 minutes or so to try and help you make sense of it. And then towards the end, I'll also say something about what it means for practitioners such as yourself. But first, maybe I thought it'd be good to talk about where it comes from. Rivers of ink have obviously been spilled in attempts to understand what's going on here, like where does this distrust and dissatisfaction with the government come from. I put like a small selection of titles that might help you navigate that field of ideas on the right, and I think that they're all very valuable contributions. But like we don't have time to go over all of that, so I just want to pick like 3 things that I think stand out of that entire pile of books and studies and what have you. People experience less stability is number 1. The predictability of life, the kind of life where you could just count on certain things to stay the same has decreased. And people find themselves confronted with fast-paced and impactful developments. Second point. Third, they have little control or experience little control over these events. And that triggers uncertainty, unrest, fear, maybe even, and also the sense that there's no one who has your back, meaning that there's no clear organization or authority that you can count on to stand up to your interests. And so in that uncertain, volatile situation, people are finding themselves having to fend for themselves. And that does something about the way you view others around you and other groups in society around you. Because those people in those other groups are not just people who just happen to live in the same country, but they are competitors. Because again, like there's no one really looking out for you, so you have to compete with these other groups, and they are maybe like after the same things that you're after, that your group is after. And so they're trying to get what you feel you're entitled to. You feel that you deserve a certain position in a society, and then there are all these other groups that are trying to get what you have, or trying to push it down. And so in what you get then is a worldview that in which society is a zero-sum game. So that means I can only win something if you lose something, and and that other group can only win something if I lose something. You could also maybe describe it perhaps a little dramatically as a war of all against all. But like whatever label you put on it, I think the gist of it is that this competition going on between all those various groups, or at least that's the way it's being perceived. And in that situation, people will be open to radical or extremist narratives, open to attempts by entrepreneurs to pitch their stories about how you should explain and understand the situation you're in. So for instance, if someone comes up to you and then says, yeah, well, that's the fact that you're feeling all this pressure has to do with the government that's working on getting as many immigrants in here as possible so that you can be marginalized. You know, those kinds of narratives make intuitive sense. And even though the anti-institutionalist extremist narratives are generally less political than, for instance, the right-wing extremist ones, they do have this notion of the government as, well, at best an obstacle that you need to work around to get what you want, but it can also become an enemy, or even a conspirator. And by that I mean that if people find themselves having to rely only on themselves and others in that group for, you know, to survive and to prosper, the government is not something that kind of helps them do that, but is something that they need to work around or actively fight to get what they want. Because in a lot of these narratives, the government is actually working with one of those other groups to help them get what they want. And because it's like in this very zero-sum game like way of viewing society, the government can easily come to be seen as an ally of one of your enemies. And if you turn that up just another notch, you're venturing into conspiracy theory territory. I recently did a comprehensive overview for the RAN about conspiracy narratives, and one of the things that I took away from that is that the belief in conspiracy theories is actually like an amplified version, or a version on steroids, of notions that are much more widespread and that are very similar. Because then there's also this idea of you being part of this a group that is under siege by what other groups are doing, what the government's doing. And so that, I think, gives you an idea of the kind of mindset that underpins a lot of these anti-authorities, extremist narratives. And then in the most extreme cases, you can indeed, I think, speak of extremism. Now, what is it in these narratives that makes them extremist? Well, to make that point, I took a definition of extremism that was formulated by J.M. Berger, and he explains extremism to mean something, to mean the notion that your survival depends on the loss of the other, of the groups that you do not consider to be part of your group or your team. So again, in order for you to win, they have to lose, and in order to make them lose, you need to take some kind of hostile action. And then, if you keep that definition in mind, and then look at the way people talked about the government during COVID, you can see a couple of elements there that line up quite nicely with that definition, and I'm just going to briefly mention 3 of them here. There's the demonization or dehumanization of people who are in the government or in powerful institutions. I put an example on this slide from the Netherlands. There's parts of it that you can read, and I think that's enough to get the gist of it, which is that the government are Nazis because of the kinds of policies that they're implementing to curb the virus. So there's like a very clear example of the demonization of the government, and you know, this type of discourse was pretty widespread during the pandemic, I believe. Second point, the notion that lives are at stake. And by the way, these 3 points are, I think, very recognizable for people who, again, like me, grew up intellectually studying terrorism, because these are also notions that you will find in groups like right after or right on the point where they decide to go from non-violent actions to terrorist attacks. But in any case, the notion that lives are at stake. It's not just that you're against these policies, it's also the case that if you don't do anything against them, you're going to perish. Again, there's just like a very strong notion that governments are out to really like repress you or hurt you or marginalize you as a group. And also the notion that, third point, regular channels have been tried and don't work. One of the things that I found concerning, monitoring the type of discourse I'm briefly summarizing for you right now, is that you could hear people say, well, yeah, sure, the protest marches and all that and the voting, that's all fine, but it doesn't really help us. We cannot count on such standard democratic measures to help us survive as a group or as a people. And I think a strong illustration from that is the response to Jurgen Konings, a Belgian soldier who went after a well-known virologist who was also advising the government on their response to COVID. And he was celebrated as like a war hero, because it says right there, Jurgen Konings, oorlogsheld, and oorlogsheld means war hero. Betrayed by the Belgian regime, honored by the Flemish people, rest in peace. That's what that picture said. And I think that's also an illustration of the way people are actually looking at that confrontation between the government and the people. So the idea that there was indeed a war going on, where either you win and they lose, or they win and you lose, is a very widespread way of perceiving the government in those circles of anti-authorities extremism. Now, with this being the mindset and the worldview, what does that lead to? The most obvious answer is, of course, violence or support for violence. And again, Jurgen Konings here on the left himself is an example of that. Although I got to say, he clearly had ties to the right-wing extremist movement, so maybe he's not the most fortunate example to use here, but he did draw a lot of support online, as I just said, and I'm not entirely convinced that a lot of that support came exclusively from people who had right-wing extremist views. Some of well, his online supporters had views that are perhaps more accurately described as anti-authorities extremists. But he is an indication of the type of incidents that this could lead to. I also think that maybe we as a anti-radicalization community have not been paying enough attention to the smaller scale violence that can also follow from this. So, like for instance, on the right, you'll see an act of vandalism, and there've been many instances of this during COVID, and they're not incidents that make headlines individually, but if you put them all together, their impact can be quite significant. People might self-censor, stay out of the media because they're being threatened. They may leave the public sector because they're constantly being harassed. And so in that way, even though it doesn't always concern acts of violence that are very salient or that get a lot of media attention, perhaps the impact that it has is bigger than we realize. But I also think that there's an important other potential impact to be taken into account here, and that is not so much that people are going to use violence, but rather that they're going to withdraw from to a place where they're out of the reach of the important institutions that they're afraid of or hostile to. So, for instance, like in what I keep hearing in the Netherlands is that people are calling local governments to asking to be removed from the official population registers. So they want out. And similar, I think there are similar movements in other countries as well. I think maybe the Reichsbürger movement in Germany, although that has a particular German flavor, is also a movement that like fundamentally questions the legitimacy of the government, and on the basis of that is trying to establish ways of living outside of the reach of the government and other important institutions. And I think that is an element that hasn't been addressed to the extent that perhaps it should be, because it can have an impact in a variety of ways. And I mentioned three here on the slide. First, that kind of withdrawal can lead to the disruption of policies. There's a lot of public policies that require the cooperation of citizens. Public health is of course an example. If people distrust the government to the point where they don't want to get vaccines anymore, that can disrupt our attempts to fight something like COVID. We also know that fighting crime and fighting terrorism is a lot easier if the relations between the citizens and the authority are good to the point where citizens are willing to, share information about crime and terrorism with the authorities. Then climate change is another example. I think it's hard to look away from the possibility that us citizens will have to do certain things in the coming years in order to fight climate change. Now, what if you have a population that is so distrustful of you or hostile to you that they're not going to do that? What's that going to do to your policies in that regard? Also, attempts to improve the standard of living in problematic areas is something that increasingly is being done not so much by governments but by citizens themselves, with governments in a supporting role. But then you also need citizens who trust the government, want to work with the government, and if they don't want to do that, then any effort along those lines is bound to fail as well. So disruption of policies. Second, also, of course, we need participation in democratic channels. If people are going to withdraw from participation in democratic processes, then of course they're not going to feel represented. Then the decisions that are going to be taken are likely to be against sort of what they want and have in mind. And so in that sense too, that kind of withdrawal can be problematic. Second, I think it's also bad for people themselves. Like if they're going to withdraw from educational institutions and public health, it can lead to some kind of self-harm or self-neglect. And so for a variety of ways, I think that the withdrawal that can also be a manifestation of anti-authoritative extremism is something to be taken into account. Now, what does that mean for practitioners such as yourselves? We've been trained to look at extremism and radicalization from a counterterrorism perspective, meaning that one of the tasks that is generally assigned to first line like the frontline professionals, is look at indicators of radicalization and terrorism, meaning be on the lookout for signs that someone may be planning an attack. And I think with this type of extremism, yeah, sure, there's as I said, a possibility that it may lead to an attack. But I also think, again, with that, the kind of withdrawal that I just mentioned in mind, I think it's also important to look for other indicators as well. So not so much is someone planning an attack, but maybe is someone drifting away? Is someone going through the process of withdrawal? Second, I think one of the things that makes this phenomenon hard to grasp is that it's a very different kind of crowd than what we're used to. And by that, I mean that these are not necessarily people who often come in contact with social workers, with health professionals, or with the police. And in that, they're different from, for instance, the group we were monitoring during the rise of ISIS. And problematic as that whole phenomenon was, at the very least, it concerned people who came in contact with educational institutions, the police, social workers, etc. With this group, they can be pretty unremarkable people, meaning that that they have jobs, that they function in a certain in ways that don't get them in touch with the police, and so finding them and reaching them may be the challenge. Third point. There are also, like, on a more positive note, I guess, there are also some lessons that still stand. So I think, like, in engaging with people who hold such views, I think it's also smart to avoid counter arguments. So trying to talk them out of believing certain things is likely to be as counterproductive as it is against other forms of extremism. The involvement of friends and family can also be important in attempts to keep someone on board, and that's obviously also a lesson that I think we learned from dealing with other types of extremism. And third, and that one's also I think particularly interesting and important regarding what I just explained about that withdrawal from society. Be sure to keep the door open to public services, like make sure that access to these institutions that can actually help people is always there. And also understand that there are underlying issues that make people susceptible to the kinds of narratives I've been describing. And that can have something to do with powerlessness, with the idea that everything's being decided and you don't get to have a say in that. It can have to do with fear. That's also something that I think was quite prominent during the pandemic. But these are things that you can address, recognize as legitimate even, and that can be the starting point of a conversation to establish or re-establish the links between people who hold such views and who want out of who don't want to be part of our society anymore, and people such as yourself who are maybe trying to avoid them doing that. And finally, and that goes back to, I guess, one of the first points I made. This is I think this phenomena is a reflection of processes that have a lot to do with like high level socio economic developments. So very specific, and like, simply put, these are not issues that you can address at the local level. So I also think that it's important to be realistic about the extent to which you can actually like eliminate this problem. I think we can make meaningful interventions on an individual basis, but like addressing the, let's say, the root causes that drive, or the factors that drive this phenomenon, call for action, I think, on a much higher political level. So don't overburden yourself with the responsibility for tackling this this kind of thing. And on that note, I would like to thank you for your attention. And well, as Rosita already mentioned, please feel free to ask questions or make comments or share your own experiences with this phenomenon. So I'd be interested to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Teun. Yes, indeed, the Q&A, it's still empty. I do have quite a lot of questions, but maybe after the second presentation, they'll come in. Now, thank you so much. I appreciate it really how you made this, distinction between the violence part and the more subtle kind of withdrawal part. I think that it's really very interesting also for practitioners in terms of, the violence related to anti-government extremist movements. We are going to share with you a few links from previous events there. As I mentioned, there was a round local meeting on this at the local level, how this is manifesting in what forms of violence, a very interesting paper, but also other relevant links. Now we are making quite a turn, but not, well, it will seem abruptly, but I would like to ask Teun later on in the Q&A to kind of maybe comment on how now the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine and all of the related conspiracies, disinformation, and so on is impacting anti-government sentiments. That will be very interested to know from your perspective what is happening there. Are people kind of opposing the government's narratives about the war? So please keep that question for later. But now we're moving to our next speaker, who is going to talk about the foreign fighters phenomenon in Ukraine as a result of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. And I welcome Kacper Rekawek, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Research on Extremism, the CIREX, at the University of Oslo. He has more than 15 years of experience in counterterrorism and countering violent extremism. That includes in academia, including his PhD at the Queen's University Belfast, and a research fellowship at the Handa Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St. Andrews, in think tanks, including at the Polish Institute of International Affairs and the third sector, such as GlobSec. And his book is coming out very soon. Please watch out for that. It's titled The Brown Red Cocktail, Foreign Fighters in Ukraine. So we'll be hearing more from you, I guess. But Kacper, now to you, because you also cannot stay until the very end. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Rosita. Thank you for having me. Good to see also old friends down, good to see you after so many years. I'll do my best to provide you with a brief rundown of a phenomenon that I understand might be a bit new to RAN practitioners. Although this is a phenomenon that obviously you partly know very well, because we've been looking at foreign fighters and the aftershocks, after waves of fallout from the phenomenon. But this time I want you to focus on the foreign fighters who go to a completely different war. And they're not all extremists. Actually, a minority, a small minority of them are. That was changing because there used to be more of the extremists amongst them. But it does not, it doesn't change the thing that I do feel that this can be an issue for people like yourselves, for people like me, as this is a phenomenon that has kind of mutated and has been mutating and has been showing us its new faces throughout the last decade or so, not purely on the Islamist/jihadist side. So this is probably why I wanted to talk about that. And I'm just bearing in mind that I will probably be mostly talking about the individuals who joined the Ukrainian side of the war. But do remember that since 2014, there was actually quite a significant number of Westerners or people from our countries, if you like, who joined the Russian side. Now, this time they did in 2014, they cannot so much in 2022 because the logistics of it are nightmarish. Now, that's why you will see me talking about one side, but don't forget, there is the other element of it, and they have been probably even more radical or more ugly politics-wise and ideology-wise when they were fighting on the Russian side. That goes against the grain of this kind of media understanding of the phenomenon. But if we could flip to the next slide, please, so that we can go on. Like Rosica kindly mentioned my book. Yes, it's coming out in December. Please do make sure to get a copy. And it is mostly about the phenomenon of 2014, but as you will see, the phenomenon kind of continues itself. So the alumni of 2014, they are still there. They're fighting. Quite a few actually died there. So this is a thing that has been going on. So it's not separate from the situation in 2022, although it is different, and I'll explain to you why in a second. Can we have the next slide, please? So essentially, there are 3 points really that I wanted to make before we go to the discussion of real practical issues that I think should be, hopefully would be of interest to the practitioners. So essentially, there are 3 points that I wanted to make. So one, when we look at foreign volunteers, because fighters join an insurgency, irregular units fighting in a war. Volunteers join essentially an army, the state. And in 2022, we're looking at volunteers that they've been joining essentially the International Legion of Territorial Defense Forces of Ukraine, now integrated into Ukrainian military, or they are simply contractors within the Ukrainian military, but don't be put away by the word. They're not making great money, So that's, if you're thinking mercenaries, I don't think you get that right in this sense. So the classic understanding of the foreign fighter / volunteer issue is that there is a war. Certain people are motivated to go there. They do go there. They fight there. Some of them have extremist, radical ideas before setting out. Some get these ideas while there. There's a trauma issue. There's an issue of disillusionment. There's an issue of simply physical exhaustion, etc. And let down, misery, etc. All these issues that you encounter in the war zone. And then some of them essentially morph into the problem that is at hand in a way. So you have radicalized extremist individuals who are actually willing to well, go back and do what? The ever-present returning issue, and whether they actually re-engage in violence. Is this an issue? Is this a problem? This is the kind of, I've given you the theoretical. Now the practical. 2014, the evidence from 2014. Yes, many of the fighters who went from the West in 2014 to join either side of the war, they had been radicals, to put it mildly, either from the far right, or actually the far left as well. If you're coming from Spain, Italy, places like that, they were coming from the far left, milieu as well, but they were mostly looking at nationalists. Funnily enough, they joined both sides, either side, and quite often end up shooting at one another, which is, we might think this is ridiculous, but in their world, in their truly postmodern world, it's not so ridiculous. Because if you make a stand, if you stand by certain colors, certain totems, essentially, not really ideology, and if you stand by your friends, and that's very important, then you act through it, and then we can shake hands, and better of us wins, and or we either meet in Valhalla and things like that. This is literally the quotes that I heard from these fighters. I've interviewed quite a few throughout the last 8 years, so you gotta believe me, on this one. So you had a per capita higher number of radical individuals amongst the ones who went to either Ukraine or Russia in 2014. However, afterwards, as they come back, you don't see them involved in political violence or terrorism, especially the far right types, back in their home countries. You see them do interesting stuff, if you like. Some of them are active in the Yellow Vest protests in France. Some of them redeploy to other wars, go to Kurdistan, try to fight ISIS. Some are mercenaries fighting different places in Africa. Some are involved in the botched attempt of staging a coup in Montenegro 2016. So they do interesting stuff, but it's not necessarily terrorism. It's not necessarily political violence. It's not the stuff that we've been looking at, and that Iran is very much and has been to some extent, preventing that about. So, and I have a research project on that, looking at the past afterlives of the 2014 alumni of the conflict. And again, please do believe me, terrorism, no. Interesting stuff, yes. Violent stuff, yes. Political violence, yes, but not so many. Now, we're in the middle of a much larger mobilization in 2022, but the issue with this mobilization is that, there's a quote from one of my interviewees who said, look, I understand. He himself was the alumni of 2014. And he said, look, I understand we had been a completely different bunch back then, but now it's basically everybody. It's the concerned citizens of the world, right, left, center, anyone from anywhere, different motivations, different jobs, different profiles, different age group as well. You know, that's a bigger span. The ones who were joining in 2014, they were 20, in between 20 and 30 years old. Now you've got, you know, people starting from 18 to 60s. It truly is a quasi-humanitarian effort. And they all say one thing, there's one thing in common, that, you know, it's a good versus, you know, bad, good versus evil. So, you know, I'm on the right side of history. You know, white versus black. That's where we go for. This is the reality, and this is where we are. So you've got a completely different mobilization. There, of course, the colors, the true all shades of the colors of that mobilization, they might actually uncover themselves or unfurl themselves to us in a way as we go on and as we go further. But all of this doesn't change one simple thing. There are 4.5 issues that I want to discuss with you, and I want to showcase to you as Quran practitioners to show you what this seemingly not so, you know, militant, seemingly benign issue might be bringing to individuals like you or me, in this sense, because I'm the researcher looking at it, but I used to work at, you know, basically a think tank connected to the government. So it is also about the certain policy issues that I wanted you to kind of maybe be aware of. So if we can flip to the last slide, please. Hello, yes, thank you. Okay, so this is the last thing. We've got 5 real issues. The first one is related to the point that you've seen before. So this is the classic understanding of the foreign fighter dilemma. So essentially, you know, our extremists go there, or our people go there, and they end up being extreme, and they will come back. Now, how do you counter that? How do you stop that? Now, this is tricky in the middle of the 2022 mobilization, because the individuals who go there, even if they are truly extreme, and as I said, that's a minority. I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. Basically, when they come back from a conflict like that and they frame themselves as the concerned citizens of the world who fought for the good cause, I don't think you can expect, you know, them to react positively to initiatives that would actually see them exit from something and, you know, get them de-radicalized. I'm dumbing it down for you. I know you know this field way better than I do. But what I'm trying to make you aware of is that these individuals will see themselves, and I've heard that in the interviews, that they're actually veterans. They fought for us, for you, for me, for the West, for Europe, for NATO, etc., etc., etc. So any attempt at punishing them will be, you know, really taken in a toxic manner. And even if this is a far right person, or some kind of, like, you know, a radical or an extremist, this will not be taken lightly. So I think bear that in mind. You know, remember the word veteran. It's not to say that I say you should unfurl policies treating them as veterans, but, you know, it's not that they're pariahs. They shouldn't be treated as such, or at least this is my impression after, you know, the conversations. So that's the first issue. Second issue is about the connectivity. So if we just focus on the, you know, extremist bunch of them, and they travel, they connect with people in Ukraine now, but in the past, on either in Ukraine or Russia. Now, I guess we got to ask ourselves a few honest questions, like, how is this possible if we know that they're going? Is this a human right for an individual in the EU to go and fight in a foreign war? I mean, I don't think so. I remember me and Rosica, we discussed this at the seminar of the EENet, so the European Expert Network on Terrorism issues, when, you know, basically I remember saying, and Rosica was there, I remember saying, like, look, this isn't a human right. There are certain states in Europe that basically try to stop any foreign fighting, whether it's jihadi or whatever. It's, you just don't go unless we give you the go ahead. We, meaning Ministry of Interior usually, or Ministry of Defense. Now we got to think about that. You know, maybe this is the way. Obviously, that brings a certain, you know, apparatus would have to be installed to actually monitor the people to make sure that they actually don't go if they're in the Schengen zone. How can you stop them getting to the Ukrainian border? You know, to what extent do you have to surveil them, etc., etc., etc. Obviously, it's easy when it's just passports and they don't have IDs. But how do you know? We really have to think about that. We have to think about passports. I think we have to think about their assets, and likewise, we have to think about passports and assets and visas of their hosts outside EU, outside Schengen. So if there's an organization that is ready to host them, if there is an organization that's ready to deploy them, and connect with them. And that organization is extremist, and that organization likes to come to Europe. We really have to think about the fact that, well, maybe it's not a human right of a non-EU organization to come here and preach to us, radical stuff and then connect with our radicals. Maybe we should really be doing something about that. So that's the second issue. The third issue, please be advised and be aware of the fact that there's a massive cognitive dissonance element here. That the right-wing extremists of Europe, quite a few, had been pro-Putin. They had not been pro-Azov or whatever you want to call it in Ukraine. They had been pro-Putin, pro-Russia. And suddenly their savior, the white angel of St. Petersburg, because he is from St. Petersburg, riding a tiger, decides to field Chechen units, Muslim units, to actually storm Kiev and deploys troops from the Eastern Military District in Russia, which is basically full of Asians, because it is an Eastern Military District, the Eastern Military District of Russia, and again fields them to attack Kiev. And the narrative suddenly goes, on these networks or these Telegram channels, in their communication, let's say bubbles, they suddenly say, well, look, the guy has betrayed us. He's using Muslims and he's using Asians to attack white people. What do we do? And there are calls from some global influencers, sometimes quite often Russians, who are saying, look, you thought he was your guy. He is anti-LGBT, anti-liberal, anti-this, anti-that. Now you see his true colors. This is basically, a red post-Soviet gulag guy who's unleashing hell on the white people of Europe. What do we do? Now, obviously, these individuals are still far right or extreme right. But there is some confusion there. Maybe there is a chance to go in with something. I mean, it's up, I'm just putting it on the table. I don't think I have the final answer, but you've got some cleavages that are opening there. And that's connected to the fourth point, the narrative of, being pro-Russian because Russia is all that West isn't, has been exposed as fake, thanks to, this part of the war. And suddenly you've got a bunch of people who are clearly confused. You will not turn them into liberal Democrats, but maybe we should be working on narratives and we should be using this space to actually, I don't know, I don't want to say convert them to something better, but well, maybe get them to disengage. That again, I wanted to put that on the table. So you've got this kind of, think of the influencers, think of the social media, and think of, maybe development of counter narratives. I think we spent like a decade developing counter narratives, against jihadists. Well, maybe that's the time to actually look at more, very, very pragmatic. That still this person is going to be beyond the pale to some extent, but maybe just a bit less beyond the pale in a sense. And the last point, which I guess it's maybe less for this for this group, but I really want to put it on the table. There are organizations held in Ukraine which hosted some of these fighters, and I say minority of these fighters. Now, these organizations are radical, and these organizations quite often had been earning their money in Ukraine from, for example, criminality. Now, if Ukraine is on a candidate path to the EU, and we might be saying, oh, not going to happen in that many years, but many things that we thought would never happen before February 24th, 2022 are now kind of happening. So I wouldn't be so sure that it's never going to happen, really. And I'm a supporter of actually Ukraine eventually, after the thorough process, joining the EU. You might be thinking of some hard discussions with Kiev, and you might be thinking about how do we convince them to actually not demilitarize these organizations, but actually dismantle. And maybe an idea is the fact that they are sometimes using criminal proceeds to finance them. Well, you cannot have organizations like that in your socio-political space if you're a candidate country or a member of the EU. So maybe that's the way, and that obviously will lead to some tough discussions. The discussions that hopefully could be having with Kiev after the war ends, and hopefully with their victory. So I'll stop there. Happy to take your questions, and then thank you for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kacper. This last slide really interesting and very relevant. I do have one pressing question because I'm not sure how much time you have left with us before you have to rush to the airport. But given that you're saying, okay, they're very confused, there's cognitive dissonance, and of course there is a chance to work, with these people in terms of narratives in particular. But also, do you see this as a vulnerability, because they seem to be kind of candidates for, in terms of some of the traits, do you expect that some extremist groups or actors will make a move on kind of trying to recruit them and kind of, host them back in a way, or attract them in their ranks? Do you think we can expect that, or are there any indications of that already?
Thank you for the question, Rosie. I would say it's like this. I don't expect the organizations as such, or their kind of organizational manifestations, to suddenly shift focus or alliances, because the ones that were pro-Russian, pro-Putinist before the war, they still are. The egg on their face is growing, but it's kind of bad to look back on like a decade of your history and just say, hey, I'm dropping this. But I can tell you that the rank and file of these organizations are really scratching their heads. And when you had this kind of before this dynamic that Nordic resistance movement members in places like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, especially Sweden, they were kind of more pro-Ukrainian, and they were absolutely dumbfounded by the organization's pro-Russia focus. I can only tell you that stuff like this is probably now deeper. So there's a chance maybe not to win over the whole structure, but actually to make sure that some of these guys will switch and go somewhere else and maybe start doubting. They doubt us, as Teun was actually telling us. They think we're all fake. It's all, Davos. It's all Jews and stuff like that. Now that we have a chance to make them doubt their leaders, their reality, and their world. What's the end game? I honestly don't know. But I think, Rosie, I would like them to be in disarray than in kind of like organized. So I guess we have a chance for that. But yes, I'll put my hands up, and I honestly don't know where it leads us. But if there's confusion, if there is like, competition inside, I don't think that's a bad thing.
All right, that's I like that actually. Of course we don't know what's going to happen, but it's kind of this optimistic tone. I very much appreciate it, and also for practitioners to think of opportunities for the future. A question for maybe for both of you, but maybe Kacper, if you want to go first, and then we can again encourage participants to ask questions in the Q&A, because there is nothing so far. How is this foreign fighter phenomenon exploited, and what are your observations exploited in terms of disinformation, conspiracies? What should be practitioners aware of? Do you have any observation about that?
Yeah, if I may go first, sorry, but thank you, Rosie.
Sure.
I would say the main disinfo around this I see is that these individuals are often portrayed as mercenaries. So obviously that has big implications for their well-being on the front lines, because if they get into the hands of the Russians, well, technically they suffer from maltreatment, to put it mildly. So the situation that happened recently, there was an exchange, and the foreigners, not all though, in core in the Russian hands were exchanged. Seems like a very positive development, but for some of them they actually waited for this for 4 months, and that is quite a lot of time during which they were simply tortured. So I'll give you this example. Then you have this idea that they appear there, the fighters, the volunteers, and then quite often they're basically being told, we're being told by some, again, influencers from the other side, saying that it's not only mercenaries, but this is basically NATO troops masquerading as some kind of volunteers, and that has huge implications as far as, for example, the Russian public's radicalization is concerned. Because then again, they get more info to say, oh right, this is actually the war with the West, and that's precisely, I guess, the message that we don't want to be sending. That we obviously are helping Ukraine, but at the same time, we're trying to stress that, like, if you stop, then that will be a completely different ballgame. Whereas this narrative influences the kind of determination on that side, which I don't think is something that we'd like to see.
Thank you so much. I'm rushing with the other turn. I'll give you the word, but we have another question on the foreign fighters from. Thank you for being here. Do you think that we treat these FTFs? Well, maybe the difference is they're not really FTFs. They're different definition, different than those joining ISIS or other extremist Islamist organizations. Kacper, very briefly.
Yeah, I would say this. Yes, we should treat them differently, because obviously they're not FTFs. That's the first point. Now we are in a bit of the British would say pickle, because even if they are extremists and they fight the good fight, you cannot really I mean, one Azov member, Azov regiment member, so this organization that everyone has been talking about and allegedly as this, paragon of extremism in Ukraine, he said to me, now we're the good guys. What will you do? But I mean, for that, we got to thank Vladimir Putin. That's how Russia framed this war. So that's why they have to be treated differently, which does not mean that their organization, their outlets, and its ideology will not be treated different, similarly or more similarly after the war. But for now, we're in a bit of a limbo here, and that's what it makes it extremely tricky.
All right, thank you, Teun. If you want to react on any of the questions so far or on Kacper's presentation, because we have time, we don't have any pressing questions from the audience so far. Of course, I have my list of questions, so don't
sure. Well, like,
yeah,
well, regarding Kacper's work, I think I can only say that we all appreciate the work that he did in trying to make sense of this whole phenomenon, and I'm actually looking forward to reading the book. One thing that I want to kind of respond to is the role of the war in Ukraine in these narratives. I think what this shows is to what extent that anti authorities extremism is actually like a worldview or a mindset almost, because what's been happening is that the war broke out, and then the media portrayed it in a certain way, governments described their position in a certain way, and then there's a segment of the population who more or less literally thinks, okay, so the media says that, and we know that the media is lying, so it has to be something completely different. The governments are saying that they're out there to defend democracy or whatever. We know that they're secretly totalitarian and all that. So it must be something completely different. And then so whatever current event you will put in front of these people, they will see a sinister government plan there. And then I think it's important to realize because it shows how deeply ingrained that way of thinking is. So it's really like a lens through which people look at what they see happening around it. So the conclusion has already been drawn, and whatever happens, be it a war in Ukraine or the arrival of groups of migrants, it will always be interpreted that way. And that's also where I think for practitioners, it's good to know that the best way, as I said earlier, to engage with people who hold certain views is not to appeal to some sort of sense of rationality or facts or logic, but to try different ways. So yeah, I think what struck me, and that's also something that came out during the comprehensive overview that we did on conspiracy theories, is that that switch from the restrictions to the war in Ukraine was so seamless, and it wouldn't maybe make sense if you don't have that worldview, but if you do have that worldview, it makes perfect sense, because then the logic goes something like this. Nothing's coincidental, and governments are always playing these sinister games, and then they lift the restrictions, and then they need something else, and suddenly there's that war. And so that's the lens it's being viewed through.
Thank you. There is another question. Could you explain what are the possible repercussions of dissemination of conspiracy theories on Ukraine among anti-government movements in the EU? Do you foresee potential violent protests in line with the anti-vax one? That was exactly my next question. So who would like to take that? Maybe Teun, it's more relevant for your
Yeah, if Kacper, if you don't mind. Well, I think in like COVID had a couple of like the pandemic had a couple of elements in it that made it particularly attractive to social movements to adopt as a cause. I think one of the most important ones is that it like truly affected the people in their daily lives, and that's probably also why it has, in that sense, been a much stronger attracting force than the war in Ukraine has. And also, it's something that everyone could like project their own views on. So one of the things that was interesting about that like anti-government movements response to the COVID restrictions was actually the diversity of those groups. So you could see like the soccer moms, and then the spiritual subculture was there, and the far right was there, and the traditional conspiracy theorists were all there with their own particular conspiracy theories that they could all project on the pandemic. And I think that if something like the pandemic happens and people's response is, oh, of course they're now trying to establish some kind of totalitarian regime, then that relationship was already fraught before pandemic, meaning the relationship between citizens and government. That was already fraught before the pandemic hit. So on the basis of that, my assessment is that response to that the pandemic or the restrictions didn't so much cause it as they exposed it. And then if that's the case, then I think it's very reasonable to suspect a similar response when again there's something that affects people in their daily lives, that people can project all their personal pet conspiracy theories on. And then I'm thinking of something like policies against climate change. It's already happening. Like the policies to deal with climate change have already been portrayed as part of the totalitarian, the new green totalitarianism or something, and it's all part of the Great Reset, right? So it's already happening. I think once those measures are gonna affect people more clearly in their daily lives, I think it's very possible that you will see the re-emergence of that very strange coalition. And then in that sense, I wouldn't be surprised if you would see like similar protests further down the road.
Yeah, and I think when we kind of break it down to very specific kind of issues, like disinformation, conspiracies related to refugees now, to gas, to whatever you name it, something that affects people's everyday lives, then yeah, I think we see already some kind of tension building up. There is another question. I will say it's $1 million question. So from the audience. I agree with the fact that counter arguments do not work. So what do the panelists suggest using instead as a message? I think Kacper already, go ahead, please. Either as an answer to that question or...
It's not, I mean, it's a very modest idea. I kind of saw how it works on some like family members of my interviewees who, quite often there's a situation in which there's a fighter, he's from one side, it's usually he's on the side of Ukraine, but his family is essentially saying, look, this is all staged. This is all, Soros, Davos, whatever, that kind of stuff. Now, but you really have to craft it carefully. But news of atrocities perpetrated by the invading troops, Russian troops, on some occasions, kind of, so not the message, please be with Ukraine because ABCD. Please fight for democracy, please fight for territorial integrity, and take a stand for the West and EU, NATO, whatever. It was basically this side is killing civilians. Obviously, the counter argument that the Russian side feels is that Ukrainians have been killing civilians in Donbass for the last 8 years. If you compare the numbers of civilians dead from Ukrainian shelling, they're less than minimal. Now you have the massacres, the very public massacres, and the fact that the Russian army is doing them. And it's almost like, in certain cases, recruitment of foreign fighters. You show the suffering of women and children, and that gets them going, to deploy to a foreign war. Now, in this case, it was exactly the same process, but for a different audience. That was kind of like, it's all staged and then stuff like that. And then they suddenly ask questions like, well, but why do they kill the children? I'm not saying it will work every time, but do not focus on the values. As Teun was saying, don't go for the rational argument. Especially that, there was this counter, this narrative that it will cost us. The support for Ukraine will cost us, in energy prices and stuff like that. Go for the emotional. And the emotional is, the tied hands behind the backs of the executed civilians. Maybe. I mean, it's horrible. It's horrible to say, like, deploy these horrific images. But, I've got some anecdotal evidence that it moved some people. I don't know how easy it would be for the EU to deploy such materials. But I guess, we're in such a game now. That would be my recommendation.
Thank you, Kacper. If I can just, if we can stay with this question for a bit longer, and maybe if I can add to that and reframe it a little bit to Teun, because we're talking about, anti-government extremism movement and anti-vax movement and conspiracy believers, this is not a compact, homogeneous group. So, because what we know about narrative work with the ISIS, FTFs and so on, you need to, know your target group, know their drivers, their, different factors impacting, their motivations. Do we know that about the group we're talking about? It's obviously a mixture of very different people. How do you have any hints on that, that we could use in PCV work, especially with focus on narratives?
Well, I would kind of maybe want to question the premise that we should tackle these issues through the use of narratives, because you're right, it's a very diverse group. Also, like narratives coming from the actor who is being suspected of all these sinister plans are like inherently incredible. So I think in engaging with people who hold such views, it's and Kacper already alluded to it. It's important to maybe not so much get distracted by let's say the content of the narratives, but then see like what lies underneath. So is there anything that drives these or that makes people susceptible to these kinds of ideas that you can actually relate to? It's normal to be afraid during a pandemic. Yes, governments sometimes do screw up. Should be able to talk about that. And so I think in addressing this other person on that level, you'll have a much better chance of like them letting their guard down, because you're not their opponent anymore. And that I think is the problematic issue about the use of narratives with people who have already made up their minds. They will also self-identify with those views to the point where anything that contradicts it is considered hostile. And also, I think it's maybe also a little, what's the word I'm looking for? Complacent, maybe, to let's say to limit the search for answers to various types of narratives, because then the assumption is that, okay, well, like we have to explain this to people the right way and then they'll understand and it'll be fine. But maybe some of these sentiment, not so much the narratives themselves, but some of the narratives that underpin this could be legitimate. I mean, there are ways in which countries could, become more democratic, in which people could have more of a say in important decisions that affect the public spaces that they're living in. So maybe I think we should also look for solutions on that level, because otherwise it's otherwise you're just gonna keep being each other's opponents, and then there's little chance that someone will actually like move over to the other side and give up their views on the government and all of these other things that we've been discussing.
Right. Thank you so much. In that respect, also, I encourage you. Well, Kacper had to leave. He has a plane to catch. Of course, we thank him very much for his participation and input. We shared in the chat a few links from previous RAN events where there are already a lot of useful ideas for practitioners, how to work with this group that we, it's not one single group, but, very different types of individuals and subgroups involved. And I remember, Teun, last time during the cross-cutting event, there was this dilemma that really became, clear in the discussions. And it was about, of course, practitioners know how to work already with radicalized individuals. Now they need to adapt what they do, so they need to hold space for, not to delegitimize certain views and beliefs, and not to, put off, let's say, these people when working with them on an individual level. So hold space for grievances to be expressed. At the same time, there is the need for kind of a more, let's say, I hate to call it a more securitized approach, but indeed, kind of we need to tackle the wider dissemination of some of these views. So would you like to reflect on that now that we gain more and more knowledge on this subject and more experience? Would you want to comment on that? What can we do about this dilemma?
Well, I think it's well, first of all, it's important that we recognize it as a dilemma, because well, you're right. I mean, like on the one hand, it's a we're bound to respect as a democracy dissent in all sorts of kinds of shapes and forms. And so in dealing with it, there's a certain lines that you cannot cross. I think there's also been like a school of thought that says that maybe you should just create some space for people to express those ideas. But at the same time, I think we're all also recognizing how harmful it can be to. So like you could compare it to smoking. Like on the one hand, you could say, yeah, sure, it's if people want to do that, then like who are we to say no? The same thing with something like disinformation. I mean, that can like I'd always be tempted to say poison your mind, and also stand in the way of people's participation in democratic processes. So we have to, I think, on a strategic level, we have to think of what is more important to us. Like I had my views on that. Personally, like if you ask me, I think that we maybe in a way do need to treat it like as something like smoking, meaning the spread of disinformation. But there's obviously not a decision that I can make by myself. But in thinking of what the various components that are involved in a strategy against this are going to do, there has to be some kind of common perception of what that approach is. So do we is our strategy to just let it exist and spread because it's we want to be tolerant of it and not give people the impression that they are being repressed, because they'll only make it worse? Or are we indeed going to say, like, this is bad for people on an individual level, this is bad for democracy, like we need laws against this? I would personally fall more on the second side, but it is important to bring out those dilemmas if we're going to devise strategies against it, because we have to work in coordination, and you cannot have one group of people that are involved in that strategy saying, oh yeah, no, like we're just going to create space for all these ideas, and then have another group of people in the same strategy saying, no, we need ways to repress this, because then like you're like creating with your left hand the problem that you're trying to solve with your right hand, or the other way around, depending on what your perspective is. So I think in like for high level policymakers, that's a call that they have to make, and like then the first step towards that is to make clear what those dilemmas are. And like I, as an analyst, do not so much consider it I mean, like, again, I have my views on it, but it's my job as an analyst is maybe not so much to say what choices we need to make, but to outline what the consequences of these various choices are. And given how widespread disinformation is, given also how clear is getting what kind of damage the kinds of beliefs that we've been discussing have on people's lives on an individual level, and democracy on a more general level. I think that if you're gonna choose that sort of, let's say, more lenient, let a thousand flowers bloom kind of approach, you're gonna have to reckon and deal with the spread of this phenomenon and all the damage that it does.
Thanks. I really take away from your answer, indeed, being aware of the dilemmas that we're facing, and then keep the conversation going towards a common perception.
Yes, of course. Like it's also a conversation that all the various actors involved in their strategy need to have with each other, and there are some hard nuts to crack. But I think it's unavoidable if you want to get serious about this.
Right, and I also thanks for bringing up this analogy with the smoking. I think during the cross-cutting, but also during the thematic event, the links are in the chat, by the way, of the conclusion papers from those events. We did speak about the addictive features of consuming conspiracies and disinformation and fakes and stuff like that. So definitely practitioners already are aware, but are increasingly becoming aware of the benefits of having that in your life, or consuming these types of narratives. So that you need to be aware of that as well, to be able to address it in your work with these individuals. I don't see any other questions at the moment. Of course, participants, the audience can email us anytime if you have any follow-up questions or any comments. We are always happy to hear from you. So Teun, if you want to have any final remarks or something we didn't manage to address, I think we're quite on time. So there are a couple minutes left before we now share also the link to the survey, but you do have the chance to say a few final words.
Well, I think that comparison with addiction is actually interesting and accurate, because in like specifically with belief in conspiracy theories, it is indeed important to realize that it does bring people certain benefits in the short term, right? They get the well, at least the illusion of certainty, and like it simplifies the world to the point where you feel that you're in control of it again. So like it also restores a sense of agency, and you can do something again. Like it does all of that. But then again, like smoking, it may feel good, like as you're doing it, but in the longer term, your relations with your loved ones are going to get strained. I mean, I've been talking to people who ran these counseling organizations in Germany, who've been getting a lot of requests from families also outside of Germany to counsel with people who went, down the proverbial rabbit hole. And like, these stories are, that can be pretty heartbreaking. And like, even beyond that, living in constant distrust is just bad for you. Like, it brings stress. It's bad for your health. And then if you're so distrustful of public health authorities that you're not going to consult those anymore, you end up in some kind of like downward spiral of social isolation and bad health. And even though that doesn't have anything to do with violence or terrorism, it is something that we need to address. And that's also why when I talk about this, I kind of try to make that case to not only look at it through that terrorism lens, because sometimes I still get the impression, like when I talk to policymakers in the Netherlands, for instance, that what they're trying to avoid is always that guy at who's going to pick up a gun and shoot someplace up. And of course, we should avoid that. And I'm not ruling out that possibility in relation to the kind of the topic we've been discussing today. But there's other aspects to it as well, and we shouldn't let that counterterrorism lens define the way we look we look at this problem. And especially practitioners will also come across those problems that are very different in nature. So I think it's important to be aware of those too. And so having an open mind and a broad perception of what this problem is and what it can do is, I think, a very important first step in dealing with it in an adequate way.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your contribution. It has been a pleasure to have this conversation and to listen to you and to Kacper, of course.